Greetings. I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Today, we hear about an important environmental change millions of years ago that significantly influenced evolution, including ours. That was the emergence of grasslands. Our guest is Aly Baumgartner, Collections Manager of Paleontology at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History in Hays, Kansas. Dr. Baumgartner uses fossil plants to reconstruct the paleoclimate and paleo environment, primarily in Kenya, in East Africa, about 20 million years ago or so. She's here to explain the relationship between ancient grasslands and evolution. Dr. Baumgartner, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
I am so excited to be here. I'm looking for any excuse to talk to people about
wonderful. Wonderful. We're going to ask a bunch of questions in that case. Dr. Baumgartner, would you start us off with the explanation of that era, that Myocene era, I guess, that when was it? And then that background of the Miocene in East Africa, just an idea.
All right. Yes. So I like to describe myself as a time traveler because I exclusively in the past. So to kind of orient us in time. So the Miocene is part of the Cenozoic. So the Cenozoic means recent life. And so that is basically all of time after the dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. So that's, to orient ourselves there, we're in the Cenozoic. And so as you are going from the end of the Cretaceous with the height of the dinosaurs, that was a really hot, humid, very tropical time period in Earth's history. And then as we go through time, the global temperatures begin to cool and they begin to get drier. So that's going through the Cenozoic. So the beginning of the Cenozoic, you have the Paleocene and the Eocene and the Oligocene. And that was a very different world from the one that we live in. This is, a world that's still recovering from the extinction event at the KPG boundary, and the continents are not quite in an orientation that we would recognize. It's a very different world. But when we get to the Miocene, things start to look a bit more the way that we would expect. So that's one of the reasons I like working in the Miocene is it's definitely different from now. But there's enough similarity that it feels like home. So the Miocene is, comparison today, it is much warmer. You tend to generally have higher levels of precipitation. But this is the point in Earth's history where the continents have a similar to modern orientation. Mm-hmm. Because during the Cretaceous, we still had these supercontinents. And by the point that we get to the Miocene, these have gotten themselves basically the way that we would recognize. During the Miocene, we also see an expansion and a diversification and origination of a lot of modern animal groups. So a lot of modern animal groups that we are familiar with, they start looking the way that is familiar to us during the Miocene.
Okay. Now, in that period, there's apparently a big environmental shift, and it affects this emergence of more plant life. Can you give us an explanation of that? Because we really had, I guess, more a forest kind of environment. Is that it? And it shifts now. And then I'm going to ask you about those grasslands in particular. So.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to orient us both in North America because That's where we live, and we're more familiar with that. But
Well,
also,
that's right. East Africa's fine. That's
I'll do a little, yeah, a little bit of both. But so in North America, North American grasslands are actually really famous during the Miocene. That's kind of one of the places where people were first studying this expansion. So as I mentioned, the Cretaceous was warm and wet, and then as we move into the Ice Age, the temperatures are decreasing and it's getting drier. So the combination of these two things, cooler temperatures and drier temperatures, is going to impact the plants, because temperature and precipitation are things that can be very limiting to plants. Plants need, if you've ever had a house plant, plants need water to survive.
Mhm.
And you also had these changes in CO2 levels in the
Right.
atmosphere. So this is
Right.
that grasses were very good at adapting to. So there were grasses as far back as the Cretaceous, but they weren't widespread. They were just present. And so leading up to the Miocene, you tended to have these either, kind of widespread forests, maybe a little bit open, but by and large, lots of forests across North America and in large parts of Africa. And then as you get into into the Miocene, you kind of have this tipping point where it's getting drier. So it's hard to be a tree in a dry environment.
Yeah.
And you have these elevated CO2 levels still. And this is really where the grasses can shine. They were able to survive in these drier environments and kind of push the forests to the margins. And part of the reason that's important is because in like North America and to a certain extent in Africa, you have these continental interiors. You have the middle of the continent that's very far away from water. And so it gets really dry in the middle of a continent. And that's a main reason why we have grasslands located where they are on a continent.
Oh, that's a great point right there. And you're mentioning now this emergence, these grasslands are taking over. I understand that these grasses evolved themselves, to adapt to this change in climate. And you often hear this term C4, right? C, the letter C4, that this made a special adaptation, and that this did it improve their nutritional content? I'd just like to get an idea of that category, because that I see a bit.
So when you think of plants, so we know that plants don't eat, they make their own energy.
Right.
They undergo photosynthesis. So C3 versus C4 is really just an explanation of the type of photosynthesis that they are undergoing.
Yeah.
So I'll explain C3 so that I can explain C4. So super simply, photosynthesis is when a plant takes CO2 from the atmosphere and water from the roots and combines it to make sugar.
Mm-hmm.
That's simply put, that's all it's doing. So the reason it's called C3 photosynthesis is because the first sugar that the plant makes is a 3-carbon sugar. So
Right.
C3.
Thank you. Yeah.
So that's C3, but we're interested in C4. So the important thing to think about is that plants are using CO2, but the main molecule that is important to photosynthesis will also bind with oxygen if given the chance. And so if you have decreasing levels of CO2, then there's more oxygen relative to CO2. And so the plant has to be careful that it's not wasting its energy using up oxygen, because you can't make it sugar with no carbon.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that C4 plants get around this is by doing things slightly differently. So instead of just opening the pores in their leaves, called stomata, letting the CO2 in, doing all of the chemical reactions and making sugar, they have to have an extra step. So they will separate where the CO2 comes in from where photosynthesis happens. And there's a fancy type of anatomy that I'm not going to go into, but that means the plant can be a little bit pickier. It can keep its stomata open, bring in as much CO2 as it can, and then it doesn't have to worry about the oxygen getting in there and ruining everything. And so this means that it is slightly energetically more expensive, but it is more efficient in the long run because you're not wasting time on things that aren't going to help you. And the first sugar that you make is a C4 or a 4 carbon sugar, so it is photosynthesis.
Clever plants. Those plants. Well, then I understand that this really had an impact on the kinds of animals and everything that could thrive, evidently, in this situation, this savannah period. Can you explain why they see a C4 plant and think yummy or something?
Not quite, but kind of close. So when we think of the expansion of grasslands, there are two main groups that we think about. We think about grazing animals, but we also think about our human relatives. So I'll start with grazing animals first. So if you think about horses, horses are grazers. They're going to go out to pasture and eat grass. But the problem with that is twofold. One, okay, so think about grass. Grass is really close to the ground. And the way grass grows up, it grows from the bottom, which is why when you cut your grass, it'll grow back. But grasses have this substance called phytoliths in them. It's silica that is inside of the leaves of the grass. So that means that the leaves of the grass are gritty. So they are going to wear down the teeth of these animals. And in addition, plants like grass is really close to the ground. It's different from like eating leaves in a tree. If you're grazing really close to the ground, you're also probably going to end up like eating dirt accidentally because they're all together. So the combination of the grit from the soil and the grit from the leaves means that like this is really rough to eat. So you see this evolution of hypsodonty. So these are these high crowned teeth. Mm-hmm. And it's this evolution of hypsodonty and the expansion of grasslands. And it's interesting because a colleague of mine, Dr. Caroline Sternberg, so she has studied the origin of grasslands in multiple continents. And there seems to be a relationship between the origin of grasses or the spread of grasses and the origin of hypsodonty, of these high crowned teeth. And it's interesting because in North America, we see a pattern where we have the spread of grasslands kind of tied to this rise of hypsodonty. But in South America, the origin of grasslands was actually a little bit later, closer to the Pliocene, and the high crowned teeth came earlier. Okay. And so it's interesting to see how these are the two players, but they're not quite doing it the same way all around the world.
Right. That's very interesting. And I can understand the teeth evolving there. So that's a really great example of that. One of the things that has come up with the savannah, and by the way, I want to check with you on this, grasses are not just those things close to the ground, but things like wheat and that sort of thing too, just to get that clarified if you can at some point. The other is that in terms of, I guess this would introduce opportunities for what became herd animals, all these animals that are in very large groups, and then that is welcome for the predator group, and that might include the humans. But one of the things that comes up with this savannah hypothesis is that it sort of pushed our ancient ancestors to walk upright, and that had an effect on the brain. It has a huge effect. Can you give us a little background about the relationship between the grasslands and this huge evolutionary push, animals, us,
right,
in Africa, because we evolved in Africa. Okay.
Yeah, so the type of animals that are living in a savanna, it's a different lifestyle. You're in an open environment. And so that's why you get these large herds, because you can't hide as well in grasses. And grasses
Yeah,
really tall. So I live in Kansas now. So there's tall grass prairie with
yeah,
grasses that are more than 6 feet tall to short grass prairie, which
yeah.
only maybe a foot tall. And so in Africa, this is like when we were studying human origins, the relationship of the environment to our evolution is so important. So
Ah,
I did my dissertation working in Kenya, working in East Africa, and I was working with a whole bunch of biological anthropologists. And people would ask me what I study, and I would say I am the context, because you really can't understand what is driving the evolution of our human ancestors unless you understand the environment that they were living in. And for a very long time, the story seemed easy, that it was just grasslands, right? Like the grasslands expanded in the Miocene, while we have the early primates are splitting off sometime in the Miocene. So, like, okay, cool, it's the grasslands that did it. And the grasslands definitely had a role in it, but it's not quite as straightforward as we initially thought. So,
aha.
it turns out that up until for a good part of the Miocene, we actually had a mosaic landscape in East Africa. So there were definitely these open spaces with grasses, but there were also large forests, and sometimes the woodlands would go into the savanna. And so it's not quite as straightforward as we thought, but there are a couple of things that this mosaic landscape is still going to be driving our large brains, our upright stance, because we know that there are lots of primates that will walk in
Mhm.
trees. So they'll kind of stabilize themselves on branches. And so it's not really that far of a change to go from I am walking on a tree branch to I am walking through the savannah. And
Right.
for a long time, we've hypothesized that our being a biped means you can see over the grass, which is very useful if you're trying to see things through the grasses. Um,
Right.
and there are a lot of hypotheses. What drove us to be bipedal? What drove our big brains? And it's hard to tell if because we had big brains we started using tools, or did we get big brains because we were using tools? And
Right. Right.
our understanding of this is constantly changing. But it is interesting that some people think that one of the upsides of being bipedal, being upright, standing on two legs, is you can carry things,
Yes.
which is really useful. You can carry objects, you can carry children. It really
Yes.
opens up all sorts of things. And so it's very important to understand the environment, because and that's where plants come in. Plants are literally the environment, because one
Yes.
of the obstacles that I ran into during my research was that there's kind of this circular reasoning that people would sometimes get stuck in. They would see a particular morphology in an animal and think, well, because the animal's bones look like this, it must have moved like this, which means the environment must have been like this. And you really can't make that third jump.
Good
Like,
point.
see what it looks like, and you can hypothesize how it moved, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it lived where you think. I mean, you'll find goats climbing trees just
Right,
because.
right, 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 exactly. No, that's an excellent point, and thanks for bringing that up. The other aspect of that you're bringing out is that scientists have to revise as evidence emerges, and that it's easy to make a correlation jump, but you have to be really, really, really careful. And that's why sometimes people question that savanna hypothesis. But thank you for bringing that up. Just very quickly, I want to shift to the work of reconstructing through these fossil plants. But did this introduce a nutritional factor for the animals and maybe our hominid ancestors? The
Yeah. So it's, if you think about like a tropical forest, the nice thing about the tropics is things will be flowering and fruiting basically all year round. And the nice thing about plants is they don't run away. So if you're
Yeah,
you're gathering fruits, that is easy. Like nutritionally, it's available all year round. And then in
Yes.
terms of like just energetic input, like I said, it's not going to run away.
Right.
But when you are in these more open environments, it does change the equation, because then seasonality is really an important factor, because things aren't available all year round, and so you might have to move more to the places where these things may be available. And then in addition, that's going to really increase the amount of meat. If you're in a place where plants aren't necessarily reliable, you are going to need to branch out and probably incorporate more meat into your diet. And that's something that people have talked about, because energetically meat is very nutritious. Like,
Mhm.
and if you're trying to feed a large brain, which is energetically expensive, meat is an easy way to get there.
Right, right, right. So it has an effect that had an effect very widespread for animals, and we can easily imagine these changes. And then you point out, but take care about making very accurate links. You have to be careful for a while. And then we get to your fun part, which is using plants to reconstruct the past. We really do not hear much about the plants. We hear about bones, but and recently it's the dust that has DNA in it and so forth. But I bet it is a blast to work with plants like this, and that's what you do happily, evidently. Could you please, I'm going to ask two things around this now, just how you work on plants, what do you do with that? And then I'm going to ask you about the museum work after that. But how do you scientists work with these ancient plants?
All right. I love talking
Your
about.
fun part.
So the thing I want to stress is that paleobotany fieldwork is different from, say, like vertebrate paleontology fieldwork, so as a vertebrate paleontologist, and I've done this, I have personal experience doing this, you'll stare at the ground looking for fragments of bone. And then when you find them, you'll try to figure out where in the rock it came from, and then you might dig out. That is not how we do botany. So what we are looking for are slabs of layers that are going to hold fossil leaves. So I work primarily with fossil leaves. And so instead of, because if a leaf fossil is normally an impression or maybe a carbonization, but regardless, if it weathers out of the rock, it is destroyed. So instead, what we do is we take out huge slabs of rock with a pickaxe and then split them open. And as my colleague Dr. Peter Wilf once said, you can't get big leaves out of small rocks. We will take out huge slabs. So here's an example. This is not from my research. My leaves are still in Kenya, but this is a Cretaceous Cretaceous Dakota sandstone leaf from here in Kansas.
Oh, you do need a big rock.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is, and I had leaves that were bigger than this. So you can see that it's an impression.
Right.
So here's the base.
I hope that shows up well. I can see it
So
quite well from here,
so if you can see
and we'll hope that does. Yeah.
But so we will take out leaves, and so during my dissertation work, I excavated hundreds of leaves. And so then we would take them back to the museum and photograph them all. And then, so what I was doing was I was photographing all of these leaves because there is a relationship between leaf shape and temperature and leaf size and precipitation. So in general, the bigger, the more precipitation there is, the bigger the leaf can get. So in tropical environments, you can have absolutely enormous leaves because water is not a limiting factor. The plant isn't going to be losing water because there's so much water in the environment. So you can have these huge leaves. So the bigger the leaf, the higher the level of precipitation. And then So there's a relationship between leaf margin, so the edges of the leaf, and temperature. So if you
Oh
think
my,
about like in North America, the further north you are, the more trees in the forest that have leaves with teeth. I mean, think about the Canadian flag. It's got a maple leaf on it.
that's
That's
right.
also
Yeah.
the north. Whereas if you go down to say like Texas or Florida, if you've ever seen a live oak leaves don't have any teeth on them at all. So in warmer places, you tend to have leaves with smooth margins, and in cooler places, you tend to have more leaves with teeth. And so we can measure these things. So we can look and figure out what's the average size of a leaf in this environment, and that'll help us figure out the precipitation, or what proportion of species in this community have toothed leaves, and then we can use that to estimate temperature. And so by doing that, we can come at this from a couple of different ways. So that gives us numbers. So quantitatively, it gives us a range of the temperature was probably in here, the precipitation was probably in here. But it also gives us just an understanding of the paleo environment. So we know, okay, well, this site had only trees, but this site had trees, but also like water lilies. That's interesting. And so we can use this fuller picture to begin filling in the background, because I like to say that plants are not just your green background. It's not just generic behind the really cool animals. By actually doing the paleobotany and figuring out, okay, what does it mean to the animals that there might have been a pond in this environment? Like, how is that going to
Right.
change what this world was like for these animals?
That's very interesting. That's fascinating. You would I mean, for instance, we never think about the teeth on the leaves. We don't think about those edgings, or for that matter, the size. So this is wonderful information, but I think it must be very exciting because you can really reconstruct climate, just and environment, as you say, whether there were ponds, all sorts of things like that. So that is really fascinating. I'm sure that is a wonderful field. And then the other thing, because we're running out of time, I'm sorry to say, but I want to get an idea of the museum work that you do, that because we don't get to go behind the scenes very often in museums. So tell us about it, please.
All right. So I am a paleobotanist now, but I started my life interested in vertebrate paleontology.
Ah,
Yeah, I thought I was going to study mammoths. Like that was my plan. And then I went
ah.
to do my master's, and
Here
my
you are with leaves.
yeah, my master's advisor said, "Hey, do you want to work on fossil plants?" Like, yeah, that seems cool. And then I realized I love it. So and then when I moved to Texas to do my PhD, I was the one of the very few paleontology grad students, and I had taken invertebrate paleontology classes in the past. And so they said, "Oh, you can teach invertebrate paleontology." So I have a background in not just paleobotany, but also vertebrate paleontology and invertebrate paleontology. And I use that while I'm here. So as
Yeah,
a collections manager, I am in charge of the geology, invertebrate paleontology, and vertebrate paleontology
I
collection.
see.
So I'm actually not in charge of the paleobotany collection, which is funny considering that I am a paleobotanist, but I help where I can. But yeah, so what I am in charge of here is day to day, just taking care of the collection. So last week, I filled a lot of loans. So we got a loan that was returned. So I had to go through because the museum hasn't been open to researchers. So instead, we will send the fossils to the researchers.
Oh, yes, that's wonderful.
So
It's
that
coming
the
now this year.
yeah. So
Yeah,
we got
yeah,
a loan returned last week. So I had to go through and make sure that we got everything. And then I was also sending a loan. So I had to go through and make sure that everything that I was
right,
sending
right,
was there. So that's part of like that's a big part of what I do is facilitating other researchers. So make
right. On that, yeah, before you leave that, I want to make sure that we get some information here that museums have much more in the collections than is on display, I think. And you brought up a very interesting point that the museums send fossils, for example, to researchers probably all over the place, which is a very great service as well. So that's pretty busy, isn't it?
It can be, especially recently. But yeah, we have at least 20,000 specimens in vert paleo, just vertebrate paleontology, more than 20,000 specimens in the collection. And we have maybe 100 things on
Yes.
exhibit. So they're really cool. We have some of our best stuff on exhibit, but like there are tens of thousands of things that are still in drawers. And the same with invertebrate paleontology.
Right.
We have like 2,000 things there. We have maybe a dozen things on exhibit. So the bulk of museums are behind the scenes, and we actually will, in normal circumstances, will invite people back to show off the collections because people don't think about this at all.
Right, right. And how important it is. I think just by the by, that has come up in the past few years where we've lost enormous collections in, say, the Middle East, like Iraq and stuff, because of war zones. And you'll never get this stuff back. And so museums are real treasure houses for us. And in terms of scientific work, obviously, you've got it all there. I think that must be just enormously rewarding work. But it's good to know, and I hope viewers notice this, that your museum and probably other museums do arrange tours in the background there so that you can see how people work with that. Do you work with your fossils there too? Do you have to analyze the fossils that in your collection?
I do some of that. Most of my work is just taking care of them. I give them a home. I mostly I'm facilitating other people, but I definitely have some ideas for things that I would like to study in my collection.
I bet. And there you have all this stuff. You didn't have to go out in the field and get it for a change. Huh? This has been a wonderful chance to talk with you, and I very much appreciate your giving us your time and doing this outreach today. And of course, I wish you the best in your career. What a fun thing. You enjoy going to work.
I do.
Thank you again, and best of luck.